Caleb made the call to leave on a Tuesday morning, when the heat in their apartment building finally gave out for good. They had been watching it happen for weeks, with the radiators going cold one floor at a time from the top down, and when their floor went quiet, he told Ivy they were done waiting. She didn't argue because she had been thinking the same thing for 3 days. They packed 2 military surplus bags they had bought 2 years earlier for a camping trip. They never took and filled them with everything that made sense. Caleb took the food first. 4 cans of soup and 2 of beans and a bag of rice that was still sealed and a box of crackers that was almost full. He took the small camp stove and 2 fuel canisters and the water filter they had ordered online back, when the outbreak was still something happening somewhere else. Ivy took the clothes. She rolled everything tight the way she had seen in a video once and packed 2 sets each of the warmest things they owned. She took the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink and the prescription bottles from the medicine cabinet, even the ones that were almost empty. She took the photo of her mother off the nightstand and put in the front pocket of her bag, where she could reach it without unpacking everything. Caleb stood at the window for a long time before they left. The street below had 3 of them moving slow near the intersection, and 2 more standing still against the building across the road. He counted exits and counted obstacles the way he had taught himself to do over the past 2 months of watching from that same window. He told Ivy they would move south toward the edge of the city, where the buildings got lower and the roads got wider and the dead were thinner on the ground. She asked him how he knew that, and he said he didn't know for certain, but it made sense, and right now sense was the best they had. They went down the stairwell with the flashlight on low and came out through the parking garage on the side street. The cold hit them the second the door opened. It was a kind of cold that got into the lungs fast and made everything feel slower. Caleb pulled his scarf up, and Ivy did the same, and they moved without talking because they had agreed the night before that talking outside was done. The first hour was the worst. They crossed 4 blocks, moving close to the buildings, and stopping every time something moved ahead of them. The dead and the cold were different from what they had seen in the early days of the outbreak. They were slower, but they were harder to read because they didn't make as much noise. 2 of them came around a corner on the 3rd block, and Caleb pulled Ivy into a doorway, and they pressed flat against the glass and didn't breathe until both of them had passed. By the time they cleared the downtown blocks and hit the wider roads to the south, the sky had gone from gray to a darker gray that meant snow before nightfall. Caleb kept them moving. They passed a gas station that had been burned down to frame, and a pharmacy with every window broken out, and a row of townhouses where someone had nail boards over the doors from the outside, which meant whoever did it was either trying to keep something in or had given up on the people inside. Ivy didn't look at the townhouses for long. They found the hardware store just before the lights started going. It sat at the corner of a wide intersection on the edge of a neighborhood that looked like it had been mostly bypassed in the early chaos. The parking lot had 3 cars in it, and one of them had been pushed up against the front entrance from the inside. The loading dock on the south side of the building still had its heavy steel door down and padlocked from within. Caleb walked the perimeter twice before he said anything. He checked every ground-level window and every door and came back to Ivy at the loading dock and told her it was the best they were going to find. She asked if he was sure, and he said he was sure enough. They found a way in through a bathroom window on the north side that someone had broken and not secured. Caleb went first, and Ivy handed the bags through before climbing in after him. The inside of the store was dark and cold, but it was out of the wind, which already felt like something. They stood still for 2 full minutes, listening before Caleb switched on the flashlight. The store was large with wide aisles and high metal shelving that still had product on most of it. There were tools and lumber supplies and insulation and plumbing parts and electrical components and bags of concrete mixed stacked on pallets near the back. Caleb moved through the aisles, slow with the light low, and Ivy stayed close behind him. They cleared the main floor in 40 minutes, finding nothing alive, and 3 of the dead that had gotten in at some point and never gotten out. Caleb handled all three before Ivy could look away. The back of the store had an office and a break room, and a receiving area, and a large warehouse space where the loading dock connected. The office had a lock on the door that still worked. The break room had a half-empty bag of coffee and 6 protein bars and 2 cans of soup and a case of water bottles that was missing 4. The generator in the warehouse was a large commercial unit bolted to the floor. Caleb checked the fuel level and looked at Ivy and told her there was enough to matter. They spent that first night in the office with the door locked and the bags still on their backs because neither of them felt ready to unpack. Ivy sat against the wall with her knees up and listened to the building settle in the cold. Caleb sat across from her with the flashlight off, and they talked in low voices about what came next. He wanted to spend 2 full days clearing and securing the building before they did anything else. She agreed. They slept in shifts, and neither of them slept well. The next 2 days were work. Caleb found plywood and screws in the warehouse and boarded up the broken bathroom window and checked every other potential entry point on the ground floor. Ivy inventoried everything in the break room and everything useful on the shelves and wrote it all down on the back of receipt paper she found in a desk drawer. Caleb figured out the generator and ran it for 2 hours to test it and to charge the small battery pack they had brought from the apartment. Ivy used insulation bats from the warehouse stock to line the interior walls of the office and the break room, which made both rooms noticeably warmer without the generator running. By the end of the second day, the building felt less like a temporary stop and more like something they could hold. Caleb said as much, and Ivy wrote it in her log. She had started keeping the log on the second morning without telling him she was doing it. She wrote down the inventory and the date and the temperature as best she could estimate it. She wrote down what they heard outside at night, which was mostly wind, and occasionally something moving to the parking lot that never stayed long. She wrote down the sounds a building made when the temperature dropped hard after midnight. There was one sound she wrote down on the 4th night that she didn't have a good explanation for. It came from above them. Not from a roof in the way that wind sounds when it moves over a flat surface, but from somewhere between the ceiling of the office and the roof itself. It was a slow, dragging sound that moved from one side to the other and then stopped. She lay still for a long time after it stopped. Caleb was asleep, and she decided not to wake him. She wrote it down instead and told herself it was the insulation shifting in the cold. By the end of the first week, they had a routine. Caleb did perimeter walk every morning at first light and every evening before dark. Ivy managed the supplies and kept the log and maintained the break room as their kitchen. They used the camp stove sparingly and ate cold when they could stand it. The dead outside were present but not urgent. A few came to the parking lot each day drawn by nothing obvious and moved on when there was nothing to hold their attention. Caleb started reinforcing the loading dock door from the inside with lumber brace against the frame. Ivy asked him how long he thought they could stay, and he said as long as they needed to. She wrote that down too. On the 11th night, the sound on the ceiling came back. This time it was longer, and it moved in a different pattern, and it woke Caleb out of a dead sleep. He sat up, and they both listened, and neither of them said anything until it stopped. He told her it was probably the structure reacting to the freeze and the way the metal roof expanded and contracted. She nodded and didn't argue. She had already written down that she didn't believe that explanation the first time she gave it to herself. The days after that were quieter, but the nights were not. Ivy stopped sleeping through them. She would lie in the dark and listen to the building and wait for the sound to come back, and sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't, and somehow the nights when it didn't come were almost worse. Caleb kept the routine and kept reinforcing their position, and didn't bring it up again. On the 19th day, Leo showed up at the loading dock door. He was pounding on the steel with both fists and making enough noise to draw attention from the road. Caleb heard it first and was up before Ivy processed what the sound was. He grabbed the crowbar from beside the door and moved through the warehouse with a flashlight, off using the thin gray light, coming through the gap at the bottom of the loading dock door. The pounding stopped, and then a voice came through the door. It was young, and it was desperate, and it was begging him not to leave him outside. Caleb stood still in the dark for a long moment. Ivy had followed him to the warehouse doorway, and they looked at each other across the dark space. The voice came again. Caleb said nothing. Ivy said nothing. Then Caleb moved to the door and pulled the brace free and lifted the latch and raised the door 2 feet off the ground. A boy slid under it and collapsed on the concrete floor of the warehouse. He was maybe 12 years old, and his left arm was wrapped in a torn shirt that was soaked through with blood. He was shaking from cold or fear or both. Caleb dropped the door back down and shot the latch while Ivy knelt beside the boy. She looked up at Caleb, and he looked at the boy, and neither of them said what they were both already thinking. They had agreed early on that it would just be the two of them. They had agreed because agreements like that felt necessary when you were scared and trying to plan. But the boy was on their floor bleeding, and the dead were outside, and the wind was hard against the building walls, and some agreements don't survive contact with a 12-year-old who is shaking and scared and alone. Caleb told Ivy to get the first aid kit. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. Ivy got the wound clean before Leo stopped shaking. It was a deep cut along the outside of his forearm that looked like it had come from glass rather than teeth, and that was the first thing Caleb needed to know. He asked Leo directly, and the boy said it was glass from a window he went through too fast, and Caleb looked at the wound for a long time before he accepted that answer. Ivy wrapped it tight with gauze from the first aid kit, and Leo sat on the concrete floor of the warehouse with his back against the wall, and his eyes moving around the space the way the eyes of someone do when they are trying to memorize exits. Caleb noticed that. He crouched down across from the boy and asked him where he came from. Leo said he had been staying with a group about a mile north in an office building near the river. Caleb asked how many people, and Leo said 8 when he left. Caleb asked why he left, and Leo looked at the floor and said it wasn't safe anymore. That answer covered a lot of ground, and Caleb let it sit for a minute before he asked anything else. Ivy brought Leo one of the protein bars from the break room and a water bottle, and the boy ate without looking up. He was thin in a way that meant he had been thin for a while, not just recently. His boots were too big and stuffed with what looked like newspaper to make them fit, and his jacket was an adult size that swallowed his frame. Caleb asked his age, and Leo said 12. Caleb asked if there was anyone looking for him, and Leo said no. The way he said it made Ivy look at Caleb, and Caleb gave her nothing back. They moved Leo into the break room for the night, and Caleb took the first watch from the office doorway, where he could see both the break room door and the warehouse entrance. Ivy sat with Leo until the boy fell asleep, which didn't take long. She came and sat beside Caleb in the doorway, and they talked low enough that their voices didn't carry. She said they couldn't put him back outside, and Caleb said he knew that. She said they needed to figure out what his story actually was, and Caleb said he knew that too. She asked what he was thinking, and he said he was thinking about the group Leo came from, and why a 12-year-old was the one who left. They sat with that for a while, without saying anything else. In the morning, Leo was quieter than he had been the night before. He answered questions, but he didn't offer anything, and his eyes still moved around every room he was in. Caleb showed him the store layout and explained the rules plainly. Nobody went near the loading dock door without Caleb present. Nobody made noise that could carry outside. Nobody used a generator without checking with him first. Leo nodded at each rule without comment. Caleb watched him nod and tried to read what was behind it. Ivy put Leo to work helping with inventory, and the boy did what he was asked without complaint. He knew what things were worth, and he knew how to stack and organize without being shown, which many had been doing this kind of work somewhere before. Ivy wrote that down in her log that afternoon. She wrote that Leo moved like someone who had learned to be useful, because being useful meant being kept. That thought stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. On the second day with Leo, the sound came back from the ceiling. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, which was new. All three of them heard it, and all three of them went still. It moved the same way it always moved, from one side to the other, slow and deliberate, and then it stopped. Leo looked up at the ceiling, and then looked at Caleb, and his expression was harder to read than a 12-year-old's expression should have been. Caleb asked him if he had heard something like that before. Leo said no. Ivy watched the boy's face when he said it. She wrote in her log that night that she didn't think he was telling the truth. Caleb went up onto the roof that afternoon through the roof access hatch in the warehouse ceiling. He was up there for 20 minutes and came back down and said there was nothing. No marks on the surface that he could see, and no sign anything had been up there. The hatch seal was intact. He said the sound had to be the structure, and Ivy said okay and didn't push it. Leo asked what was on the roof, and Caleb said nothing, and Leo nodded and looked at the floor. Ivy noticed that Leo didn't look relieved when Caleb said nothing was up there. Most kids would have looked relieved. By the third day, Leo had started talking more. He told them about the group in the office building in small pieces, the way someone does when they're deciding how much to give away at a time. He said the group had been there since early in the outbreak. He said there were two men who made most of the decisions, and that the other people mostly went along with what those two said, because the alternative was being outside alone. Caleb asked him about the two men, and Leo said one of them was named Mitch. He said it the way you say a name when the name itself carries weight. Ivy looked up from her log when she heard it. Caleb asked what Mitch was like, and Leo was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own answer. Then Leo said Mitch was the kind of person who was good at making you feel like everything was his idea, even when it was yours. He said Mitch had a way of figuring out what you had before you told him, and then figuring out how to get it. Caleb asked Leo what Mitch had taken from him, and Leo said he hadn't taken anything yet. The word yet landed in the room, and nobody picked it up. Caleb started watching the perimeter differently after that conversation. He added a midday check to his morning and evening walks, and started paying attention to whether the same dead were coming to the parking lot more than once. On the fifth day with Leo, he noticed two of them that had been through the lot the day before coming through again from the same direction. That wasn't normal behavior. Dead didn't usually retrace the same ground that precisely. He didn't say anything to Ivy about it that night, but she found it in his notes the next morning when she was updating the log. She added her own note underneath his that said she had been hearing something outside the north wall after midnight for the past 2 nights. Not the dead. Something quieter. Something that stopped when she shifted position inside the room, as if whatever was could hear her move. She left the log on the desk where Caleb would find it and went to start the morning ration. Leo was already awake when she got to the break room. He was sitting at the small table with his hands around a water bottle, staring at the wall. She asked him if he had slept, and he said some. She asked him if he was okay, and he looked at her in a way that was too old for his face, and said he thought they should check the loading dock door. She asked him why, and he said he just thought they should. Caleb was already in the warehouse when they got there. He was standing in front of the loading dock door, looking at the floor. Ivy followed his eyes down and saw it. There was a thin line scratched into the concrete floor just inside the door. It was deliberate, and it was recent, and it hadn't been there the day before. It was a single straight line about 6 inches long, pointing directly at the door from the inside. Caleb looked at Leo, and Leo looked at the line and said nothing. Caleb asked him if he knew what it was, and Leo said no. Ivy watched the boy's hands tighten around the water bottle he was still holding. She wrote in her log that afternoon that she believed Leo knew exactly what it was, and that whatever it meant, it was not good for any of them. Caleb spent the rest of that day reinforcing the loading dock door with everything he could brace against it. He added lumber to the cross brace and ran a chain through the interior handle bolted to a floor anchor he drilled into the concrete. Leo watched him work without offering to help, which was different from every other day. Ivy kept her distance and kept writing. She wrote down the scratch mark in the chain and the way Leo's hands had gone tight on the water bottle. She wrote down that she hadn't made the scratch and that the floor had been clear when she was last in the warehouse alone. She wrote that the only time the warehouse was empty of all three of them was the 2 hours after midnight, when Caleb slept and she kept watch from the office, and Leo was supposed to be in the break room. She underlined that twice. That night, she didn't sleep during her off shift. Around 2 in the morning, she heard Leo get up. His footsteps moved toward the warehouse and stopped. 5 minutes passed. Then the footsteps came back. In the morning, she told Caleb everything, and when she was done, he said they needed to have a direct conversation with Leo that day. Not careful questions. A direct conversation about Mitch and the scratch, and where Leo went at night. Leo was gone before they got to the break room. His blanket was folded on the table, which was not something a panicked 12-year-old would stop to do. His water bottle was gone, and so was the protein bar Ivy had set aside. Caleb checked the warehouse and the store floor and the bathroom and came back saying the boy was gone. The boarding on the bathroom window had been loosened and reset carefully enough that it looked undisturbed until you pushed on it. Leo had gone out the same way they had come in. Caleb reset the board and drove 2 more screws through it. Ivy stood in the doorway and tried to work out what it meant. Leo leaving on his own terms with supplies and a folded blanket was different from running scared. It looked planned. She asked Caleb what he thought Leo had told Mitch through the scratch mark or however he had been communicating, and Caleb said he didn't know, but he thought they were about to find out. He went to start the second reinforcement on the loading dock, and Ivy went back to the office and opened her log. She wrote down the folded blanket. She wrote down the missing water bottle and the protein bar. She wrote down the loosened board and the 2 extra screws Caleb had put through it. Then she wrote down a question she didn't have an answer to yet. She wrote down whether Leo had come to them bleeding because he needed help or because someone sent him to find out what they had and how well they were protected. Outside, the wind had dropped and the parking lot was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Caleb came back from the loading dock 20 minutes later and stood in the office doorway and said there was a man standing at the edge of the parking lot looking at the building. He was just standing there, not moving, not reacting to the dead that were drifting past him, just looking at the building the way someone looks at something they have already decided belongs to them. The man in the parking lot didn't move for a long time. Caleb watched him from the narrow gap between the plywood and the window frame in the office and counted the minutes. The man was average height and wore a heavy coat and a wool cap pulled low, and he stood with his hands in his pockets like someone waiting for a bus. The dead drifted past him, and he didn't react to them, and they didn't react to him, which was the part that bothered Caleb most. That kind of comfort around the dead wasn't something you stumbled into. It was learned, and it took time, and it said something specific about a person. After about 20 minutes, the man turned and walked back toward the road and disappeared around the corner of the building across the street. Caleb stayed at the gap for another 10 minutes before he moved. He found Ivy in the break room and told her what he had seen, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she opened her log and wrote it down. She asked if it was Mitch, and Caleb said he didn't know, but he thought it was likely. She asked what they should do, and Caleb said they should act like nothing had changed while changing everything they could quietly. He meant the supplies first. He spent the rest of that morning moving their most critical stores from the break room into the office. Food, water, the first aid kit, the battery pack, the camp stove, and the fuel canisters. He wanted everything they needed to survive in the one room with a lock. Ivy helped without being asked, and they worked fast and quiet. By midday, the office looked different, and the break room looked emptier, and Caleb felt marginally better about their position without feeling good about it. In the afternoon, he did the perimeter walk in extra time and found nothing changed on any side of the building. The parking lot was empty. The road beyond it was empty. The neighborhood beyond that was still in gray under a flat winter sky. He came back inside and told Ivy it was clear for now, and she nodded and didn't look up from the log. She was writing about Leo. She had been piecing together everything the boy had said over the 5 days he was with them and writing it in order and looking for what didn't fit. She told Caleb what she had found when he sat down across from her. Leo had said the group in the office building had been there since the early outbreak. He had said there were 8 people when he left. He had said Mitch and one other man made the decisions. But he had also said at one point that they had moved locations twice since the outbreak started, which meant the office building wasn't their original base. He had said they were well supplied without explaining how a group of 8 people stayed well supplied this far into winter. He had said Mitch was good at figuring out what people had before they told him. Ivy said she thought that meant Mitch sent people out specifically to find what other survivors had, and then found ways to take it. Caleb asked her if she thought Leo was one of those people, and she said she thought Leo had been doing it long enough that he was good at it, but maybe not long enough that he was okay with it anymore. Caleb sat with that for a while. He thought about the way Leo had folded his blanket before he left. He thought about the way the boy had suggested they check the loading dock that last morning. He thought about the scratch mark on the floor and what it might have meant as a signal to someone outside. Then he thought about the fact that Leo had been the one to bring them to the door at a moment when whatever was going to happen next could still be stopped if Leo chose to stop it. He wasn't sure what to do with that. The next 2 days were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No sign of the man in the parking lot. No sound from the ceiling. No movement outside the north wall at night. Ivy wrote in her log that the quiet felt like the pause before something, and Caleb didn't argue with that. He started rationing the generator fuel more carefully and stopped running it all after dark. So the building gave nothing away to anyone watching. They ate cold and moved with the flashlight on the lowest setting and talked less than they had before. On the 3rd day after Leo left, the knock came at the loading dock. It was not frantic like Leo's had been. It was 3 slow, deliberate knocks with enough space between them that it was clearly a choice and not a panic. Caleb and Ivy looked at each other across the office. Caleb picked up the crowbar. They moved to the warehouse together, and Caleb put his mouth close to the door and asked who was there. A man's voice came back clear and calm. He said his name was Mitch, and he said he wasn't there to cause problems, and he said he thought they should talk. Caleb said nothing for a moment. The voice came again and said he knew they had taken the boy, and that the boy had told him they were decent people, and that decent people were hard to find. Caleb looked at Ivy. She was looking at the door. The voice said he had supplies he was willing to trade and information about the area that they probably needed, and that all he wanted was a conversation. Caleb told him to step back from the door and come around to the north side of the building where there was a window and they could talk through the boards without opening anything. There was a pause, and then the voice said that was fine. They moved to the north wall, and Caleb pulled back one edge of the board over the narrow window there just enough to see out. The man standing outside matched what Caleb had seen in the parking lot. Average height heavy coat, wool cap. He had his hands visible at his sides, which Caleb noticed immediately. He stood about 4 feet from the building, and his face was calm in a way that people's faces are calm when they have decided the outcome of the situation already. Mitch said he was glad they were willing to talk. He said he had been watching the building for a few days, and he could see they had done good work securing it. He said that kind of work was exactly the sort of thing his group respected. Caleb asked him what he wanted, and Mitch said he wanted the same thing everyone wanted, which was to get through the winter. He said his group was nearby and well organized, and that combining resources made more sense than 2 groups burning through supplies separately. Caleb said they were doing fine on their own. Mitch smiled at that. It was a patient smile, the kind that has heard that answer before and already knows what comes next. He said he understood that, and he said he would give them some time to think about it, and he said he would come back in a few days. Then he put his hands back in his pockets and walked away without hurrying. Caleb watched him go and kept watching the space where he had been for a long time after he disappeared. Ivy was writing before they even got back to the office. She wrote down everything Mitch had said in the order he said it. She wrote down the smile. She wrote down that he had said he had been watching the building for a few days, which meant he had been there before Leo left and possibly before Leo arrived. She wrote down that he had called them decent people based on what Leo told him, but that Leo had only been with them 5 days and had spent most of that time being careful about what he said. She underlined one line at the bottom of the page. It said Mitch already knew what he was going to do. The conversation was not him deciding. It was him giving them the chance to make it easier. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep during his off shift. He lay in the office running through their position. They had food for maybe 3 more weeks if they were careful, water from bottles and melted snow, tools and building materials, and a generator with limited fuel, and a locked room. 2 people. Mitch had at least 8. He thought about the scratch mark and what it said about Mitch's patience. He thought about Leo being sent in like a scout. He thought about the smile. He thought about Ivy's note at the bottom of the log. In the morning, he told Ivy he wanted to go out and see the office building where Leo had said the group was staying. He wanted to look at it from a distance and count what he could count. Ivy said she didn't want him to go alone, and he said one of them needed to stay with the building. She said she didn't like it, and he said he didn't either, but he needed information, and right now Mitch had more of it than they did. She packed him extra layers and handed him the smaller bag with water and 2 protein bars. She watched from a bathroom window until he disappeared north along the building line, then went back to the office and sat with the log but couldn't focus. After an hour, she heard the ceiling sound again. It was the middle of the morning, and the light through the boarded windows was gray and flat, and the sound moved the same way it always moved and stopped the same way it always stopped. She sat very still until it was done. Then she got up and went to the warehouse and looked at the roof hatch. The hatch was a pull-down type with a folding ladder. Caleb had checked it after the first sound and said the seal was intact. She pulled over a stepladder and climbed up and put her hand flat against the latch. She didn't open it. Then she felt something else. The faintest vibration coming through the hatch from the other side. It stopped almost immediately. She climbed down and put the stepladder back exactly where she had found it and walked back to the office and sat down. She picked up the pen and opened the log. She wrote that the hatch seal was not intact. She wrote that something was in the space between the warehouse ceiling and the roof. She wrote that it had been up there since before they arrived and that it had been listening. She wrote that she was going to wait for Caleb to come back before she decided what to do about it. Then she wrote that she wasn't sure how long she could wait. Caleb came back 2 hours, later moving fast across the parking lot. He came through the bathroom window and pulled it shut behind him and found Ivy in the office. He said the office building was occupied. He had counted at least 6 people moving on the lower floors through the windows. He said the building was well set up with boards on the windows and what looked like a watch position on the 2nd floor. He said Mitch's group was not 8 people. Based on the movement, he had seen it was closer to 15. He stopped when he saw Ivy's face. She turned the log around and pointed to what she had written about the hatch. He read it twice. Then he looked at the ceiling. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Caleb said they had a problem above them and a bigger problem coming from the north, and they needed to figure out which one to deal with first. Caleb decided to deal with the hatch first. He said whatever was up there had been up there the whole time and hadn't come down, which meant it either couldn't or was choosing not to, and either way he needed to know which one it was before Mitch came back. Ivy didn't argue. She stood in the warehouse with the crowbar, while Caleb climbed the stepladder with the flashlight clipped to his jacket. He put both hands on the hatch and looked down at Ivy, and she nodded. He pushed the hatch up and swung it open and pointed the flashlight into the space above. It was a crawl space about 3 feet high running the full length of the warehouse ceiling, between the drywall and the metal roof decking. Insulation bats lined the floor of it in sections with gaps between them where the joists ran. Caleb swept the flashlight across the space in both directions. At the far end near the north wall, something reflected the light back. He stayed on the ladder with the hatch open and looked at it for a long time. It was a person. They were pressed flat against the insulation near the north wall with their face turned away from the light. Small, too small to be an adult. Caleb said Leo's name. The shape at the far end of the crawl space didn't move for a moment and then slowly turned its face toward the light. It was Leo. He was filthy and his eyes were red from cold or crying, and he had his knees pulled to his chest. Caleb told him to come down. Leo crawled the length of the space slowly and lowered himself through the hatch and down the ladder and stood on the warehouse floor in front of them. Ivy looked at the boy and then at Caleb, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Caleb asked Leo how long he'd been up there, and Leo said since the night he left. That was 3 days. Caleb asked him why he went up there instead of leaving the building, and Leo looked at the floor and said he didn't have anywhere to go. Caleb asked him what that meant given that he had a group a mile north, and Leo said he couldn't go back there. Caleb asked him why, and Leo said because Mitch knew he hadn't finished the job. Ivy asked him what the job was, and Leo looked up at her, and his face was very tired for a 12-year-old face. He said the scratch on the floor was a signal that the building was worth taking. He said there were other signals too. He had left a mark on the outside of the north wall the first night he went out to the warehouse. He said Mitch's system was that the scout marked the location and then left, and Mitch's people moved in within a week. Leo said he had made the mark and then decided he didn't want to finish it. He said he had gone back outside to remove the mark before anyone saw it, but it had already been found. He knew because someone had added a second mark next to his. That meant Mitch already knew the location, and Leo going back to the group empty-handed would have told Mitch that Leo had tried to pull back the job. Leo said he had come back inside because he didn't know what else to do. Caleb listened to all of it, and when Leo was done, Caleb asked him one question. He asked Leo if the mark on the outside wall was enough for Mitch to act on, or if he needed more information first. Leo said Mitch would want to know how many people were inside, and what the entry points were, and what the supply level looked like before he moved. He said Mitch was patient and precise, and he didn't move until he knew he could win. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at Ivy, and she was already thinking what he was thinking. Mitch's conversation at the window 2 days ago hadn't been a negotiation. It had been a final assessment. He had seen 2 people in a secured building and a supply level that suggested they were doing well enough to be worth taking. The timeline Caleb was working with just got shorter. He sent Leo to the break room and told him to eat something and stay away from all exterior walls. Then he sat down with Ivy in the office and they talked through what they had. The crowbar and a hammer, and 2 utility knives and a length of heavy chain were their weapons. The office door with its lock and its reinforced frame was their fallback position. The generator was a liability now, because running it told anyone outside the building was occupied and active. Caleb turned it off, and they went to battery power only. Ivy pulled up the log, and they went through the supply inventory together. 3 weeks of food, if they were careful. Enough water for 10 days without melting snow. First aid supplies for minor injuries. Nothing that changed the math on a confrontation with 15 people in a meaningful way. Ivy asked Caleb what he wanted to do, and he said he wanted to avoid a direct confrontation for as long as possible and use the time to make the building harder to take. She asked how, and he said he had been looking at the store inventory since the beginning with this possibility in the back of his mind. There were things on those shelves that could make entry into building costly enough that a group might decide it wasn't worth it. He didn't say what things. He just said he needed a day to set it up, and he needed Ivy to keep watch from the office window while he worked. She said okay. He worked through the rest of that day and into the night with the flashlight on low. Ivy kept watch, and Leo slept in the corner of the office on his folded blanket with his back against the wall. Around midnight, Caleb came in and washed his hands in the last of the clean water they had set aside for that purpose and sat down across from Ivy. He said he had done what he could on the ground floor entry points. She asked him if it would be enough, and he said it would slow them down and make them cautious, and that was the best he could promise. She wrote that in the log. The next morning, Mitch came back. He came to the loading dock again with the same 3 slow knocks. Caleb and Ivy were already in the warehouse when they heard it. Caleb put his mouth to the door and asked what he wanted. Mitch's voice came through calm as before. He said he had given them time to think, and he was hoping they had come to a decision. Caleb said they had decided they were staying as they were. Mitch was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood and that he respected that, and that he was going to be honest with them because he thought they deserved honesty. He said his group needed a winter base, and this building was the right size and the right location, and they had already identified it as their best option. He said he wasn't asking anymore. He said he was giving them the chance to walk away clean with their supplies and their safety guaranteed, and he said that offer had a short shelf life. Caleb said nothing. Ivy was beside him with her hand tight around the crowbar. Mitch said he would be back tomorrow morning, and he hoped they would make the smart choice. His footsteps moved away from the door and faded. Caleb and Ivy stood in the dark warehouse, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Leo appeared in the doorway from the main store floor. He had heard everything. He looked at Caleb and said Mitch always kept his word about the offer, and also always kept his word about what happened after expired. Caleb asked him what happened after expired, and Leo looked at the floor and said the last group that said no didn't get a chance to say anything after that. Ivy wrote that down when they got back to the office. She wrote it at the bottom of the page and underlined it once. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote one line at the top. It said they had until morning. Caleb sat with that for a while, then said they needed to talk about Ada. Ivy looked up from the log. He said on his scouting run 2 days ago he had seen something he hadn't mentioned because he wasn't sure what to make of it. 2 blocks east he had spotted a woman moving alone between buildings. She was quiet and deliberate, and she had seen him the same moment he saw her. Neither of them ran. They had stood looking at each other, and she had held up one hand palm out, and he had done the same. She looked to be in her 40s with a pack and the movement of someone who had been alone a long time. He had kept moving, and so had she. Ivy asked why he hadn't said anything, and he said it seemed like a random encounter. She asked why he was bringing it up now, and he said because anyone moving alone that close to Mitch's base either didn't know it was there or had a reason Mitch didn't know about. Either way, she might have information they didn't. Ivy asked how they would find her, and Caleb said he wasn't sure, but that he was going to go back to that side street in the morning before Mitch's deadline and see if she was still in the area. Ivy said she didn't want him leaving the building the morning Mitch was coming back, and Caleb said he would be back before Mitch arrived and that they needed any advantage they could get. She wrote it down without commenting further. Leo asked from the corner who Ada was, and Caleb said he didn't know yet. Leo said that anyone moving alone near Mitch's group was either very stupid or very capable, and Caleb said that was exactly what he was counting on. That night was the longest they had spent in the building. Ivy kept watch and Caleb slept in 2-hour blocks, and Leo sat against the wall with his eyes open. The building was quiet. No sounds from above now that Leo was down. No movement in the parking lot. The dead had been thin for 2 days, which Caleb thought might mean Mitch's group had been clearing the area in preparation. At 3 a.m, Ivy woke Caleb and pointed to the window. There was a light moving at the far edge of the parking lot. Not a flashlight, something smaller. It moved in a slow arc and then went out. Caleb watched the spot where it had been for 10 minutes. Nothing else moved. He went back to his sleep shift, and Ivy stayed at the window and wrote in the log that the light had looked like it could have been a signal. She wrote that they were being watched in shifts. At 5 in the morning, Caleb got up and layered up. Ivy handed him the smaller bag and the utility knife and told him to be back in an hour. He went out the bathroom window into the dark and the cold and moved fast toward the east side street. Leo sat beside Ivy in the office and they waited. Caleb was back in 40 minutes. He came through the window with frost on his jacket and his breath coming hard. He said he had found the woman. She had been watching the office building from a fire escape on the east side, and she had seen him coming and waited. He said her name was Ada, and she had been watching Mitch's group for 11 days. He said what she told him in 10 minutes had changed everything they thought they knew about what was coming. Ada had been following Mitch's group for 3 weeks. That was the first thing she told Caleb on the fire escape, and it was a thing that reframed everything else she said after it. She wasn't a survivor who had stumbled onto them. She was tracking them deliberately, and she had been doing it long enough to know their patterns and their numbers and the way Mitch operated when he had a target locked in. Caleb brought her back to the building that morning. He didn't ask Ivy first because there wasn't time and because he had made a judgment call standing on that fire escape in the dark that Ada was the most useful person they had encountered since the outbreak started. Ivy met them in the warehouse with the crowbar in her hand and looked at Ada for a long moment before she lowered it. Ada was 43 and had the kind of stillness about her that came from a long time spent being careful. She had a pack that was better organized than anything Caleb had seen and a fixed blade knife on her hip that had seen use. She looked at Leo when she came into the office, and Leo looked at her, and something passed between them that Caleb and Ivy didn't fully understand. Ada asked Leo if Mitch knew he was here, and Leo said he didn't think so. Ada nodded like that was the answer she expected. Caleb asked her to tell them what she had told him outside, and she set her pack down and sat in the chair across from the desk and talked for 20 minutes without stopping. Mitch's group had started as 12 people in the first month of the outbreak. They had been based in a church on the north side and had supplies and organization, and by all accounts were doing what a survivor group was supposed to do. Then Mitch had taken over from the original leader around week 6, and things had changed. Ada knew this because her brother had been in that group. His name was Paul, and he had been one of the 12 originals, and he had stayed through the leadership change because leaving alone felt worse than staying and watching. Ada said Paul had sent her a message through a relay of 3 other survivors sometime in the second month, telling her where the group was, and that things had shifted in a direction he was worried about. She had been trying to reach him ever since. She had tracked the group through 2 location moves and watched from a distance as the group grew from 12 to what was now closer to 18. She said the growth was not people joining willingly. Caleb asked her what that meant, and Ada looked at him steadily and said it meant Mitch's method of acquiring resources had expanded from supplies to people. Ivy stopped writing. Leo looked at the floor. Ada said Mitch kept people useful and compliant through a combination of controlling the food supply and making the alternative to staying clear enough that nobody tested it. She said the group had 3 people in it right now who were there the same way Leo had been there, which was because leaving meant Mitch decided what happened to you on your way out. Leo didn't look up from the floor when she said that. Ivy reached over and put her hand briefly on Leo's arm. Ada said her brother was still in there as far as she knew. She said she had been watching the building for 11 days trying to work out a way to get him out, and she hadn't found one alone. She said when she saw Caleb 2 days ago, she had recognized the look of someone doing the same kind of calculation she was doing, and she had decided to wait and see if he came back. Caleb asked her what she was proposing, and Ada said she wasn't proposing anything yet. She said she was telling them what she knew and letting them decide what to do with it. She said the one thing she was certain was that doing nothing was not a viable option because Mitch was moving on their building today and a passive defense against 18 people was not going to hold. Caleb looked at Ivy, and Ivy looked at the wall for a moment and then looked back at Caleb. She asked Ada how much she knew about the interior layout of Mitch's base. Ada pulled a folded piece of paper from the side pocket of her pack and laid it on the desk. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of the office building 2 blocks north. It was detailed. It had entry points marked and positions labeled, and a note in the margin that said watch rotation every 4 hours. Caleb looked at it for a long time. Then he asked Ada if she was willing to go back there. She said she had been waiting 11 days for someone to ask her that. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Caleb laid out what he had done to the ground floor entry points of the hardware store the night before. He had used materials from the shelves to create a series of obstacles and hazards at the 3 most likely entry points that would slow a forced entry significantly and make the first people through each point regret it. It wasn't a permanent defense, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be enough to create chaos and noise and hesitation in the first 2 minutes of an entry attempt. Ada listened to the details and added 2 suggestions that Caleb incorporated immediately. Leo sat in the corner and listened, and when Caleb asked him if there was anything about Mitch's approach tactics, he should know Leo said Mitch always sent 2 people in first to draw out the defenders before the main group moved. He said those 2 people were usually the ones Mitch considered most expendable. Ivy wrote that down and then put the pen down and didn't pick it up again for a while. The plan they settled on was not comfortable, and it was not safe, and it required all 4 of them to do things that none of them, except possibly Ada, had done before. Caleb went through it twice to make sure everyone understood their position and their job. Ivy asked 3 questions, and each one sharpened a detail that needed sharpening. Leo asked 1 question. He asked what happened to the people in Mitch's group who were there the same way he had been there. Caleb said the plan accounted for that as best it could. Leo nodded and didn't ask anything else. At 9 in the morning, Mitch knocked on the loading dock again. Caleb went to the door alone this time and asked him what his answer was. Mitch said he was hoping they had come to the right decision. Caleb said they had, and that the decision was no. Mitch was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said that was disappointing, and that he hoped they understood what it meant. Caleb said he understood exactly what it meant. Mitch's footsteps moved away from the door. Caleb stood in the warehouse and listened to them fade, and then stood in the silence that came after. He went back to the office and looked at Ivy and Ada and Leo. He said they had maybe 2 hours before Mitch organized his people and moved. Ivy stood up and picked up the crowbar. Ada shouldered her pack and checked the knife on her hip. Leo stood up from the corner and looked at Caleb and said he wanted to help. Caleb looked at the boy for a moment. He thought about the folded blanket and the scratch mark and the 3 days in the crawl space and the 1 question Leo had asked about the people who were there the same way he was. He handed Leo the hammer from the workbench. Leo took it with both hands and held it aside. Ivy looked at Caleb, and he looked back at her, and in that look was everything they had carried out of the apartment, and everything the winter had cost them, and everything that was about to happen in the next 2 hours. Then they moved to their positions and waited. The first hour waiting was worse than anything that came before it. Caleb was at the warehouse entrance with sight lines to the loading dock and main store floor. Ivy was in the break room doorway covering the north wall entry point where Caleb had done most of his overnight work. Ada was near the front of the store behind a shelving unit with a view of the boarded entrance and the side door. Leo was in the office with the door locked and instructions to stay there no matter what he heard. He had not been happy about it, and Caleb had told him plainly that staying alive was not a small job. Leo went in without arguing. At 40 minutes into the wait, Ivy heard something at the north wall. It was not the dead. It was a specific sound of someone testing a board from the outside, pushing it slightly to feel where it was fixed and how solidly. She held her position and controlled her breathing and did not make a sound. The testing stopped after 30 seconds. 8 minutes later, Ada heard movement at the front entrance. 2 sets of footsteps on the concrete, outside, moving slow and deliberate and stopping at the boarded door. Then silence for 2 minutes. Then one of the boards shifted. They worked quietly, and the board came loose from the bottom without the noise of a forced entry. Ada watched the gap open at the bottom of the front door. 2 pairs of boots. They were waiting before coming through exactly as Leo had said Mitch's advanced people would do, listening for a response. Ada did not give them one. At the loading dock, Caleb heard the chain on the door handle go tight. Someone was pulling on it from outside with enough force to test the anchor bolt in the floor. It held. The pulling stopped. Then something metal slid under the gap at the bottom of the door and began feeling along the floor for the base of the brace. Caleb watched it move and did not move himself. He thought about Ivy at the north wall, and Ada at the front, and Leo in the locked office. He thought about the first night in the building with their bags still on their backs, and how far they were from that night. The metal rod under the loading dock door found the base of the brace, and began working at it with a patience that said Mitch's people had done this before. Caleb let them work for 45 seconds. Then he picked up the crowbar and struck the concrete floor, once directly in front of the loading dock door. The sound rang through the warehouse like a bell. Everything outside went still. He struck it again. Then he said in a clear voice that carried through the door that the first person through any entrance in this building was going to have a very bad morning. He said there were 4 of them and they had been ready since yesterday. He said the building had been prepared for an entry attempt, and prepared meant something specific, and they were welcome to find out what. He said the alternative was for Mitch to come to the door himself and have a real conversation. The silence outside lasted a long time. Ivy heard the north wall go quiet. Ada watched the boots at the front door go still. The metal rod withdrew from under the loading dock door. Then Mitch's voice came through the loading dock door. It was still calm, but it was a different kind of calm than before. He said he was impressed. Caleb said he wasn't trying to impress anyone. Mitch said he had 15 people outside, and Caleb said he knew that, and said the number didn't change what he had just told him. Mitch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you actually want?" Caleb said he wanted to talk about Paul. The silence after Caleb said Paul's name lasted a long time, long enough that Ivy came to the warehouse doorway to check on him, and he held up one hand to tell her to stay back. The loading dock door was still. The parking lot beyond it was still. Then Mitch's voice came through, and it was the first time it had lost its evenness. He asked how Caleb knew that name. Caleb said he had a friend of Paul's with him, and that the friend had been watching Mitch's group for 11 days and had information about what went on inside that building that Mitch probably didn't want shared any wider than it already had been. Another silence. Caleb waited it out. He was good at waiting now. Mitch asked what Caleb wanted, and Caleb said he wanted Paul out of the building and walking free before the end of the day, and in exchange, he would keep what he knew quiet and leave Mitch's group to do whatever they were going to do somewhere else. Mitch said that wasn't how things worked, and Caleb said he understood that, but suggested Mitch think about how things worked when the people you were trying to take a building from had nothing left to lose. He said Ada knew enough about Mitch's operation that as she started talking to other survivor groups in the area, the reception Mitch got at his next location would be considerably less cooperative than the one he had been getting. He heard Mitch breathe through the door. It was the breath of someone recalculating. Caleb gave him the time to do it. Ivy had come fully into the warehouse now and was standing 10 feet behind him, and he could feel her watching his back. Ada had moved from front of the store and was standing at the warehouse entrance. Leo was still in the locked office. Mitch said he needed an hour to think. Caleb said he had 30 minutes, and that Ada would be visible at the north wall window. During that time, as confirmation, they were serious. Mitch's footsteps moved away from the door and faded across the parking lot. Caleb turned and looked at Ivy and Ada. Ada nodded once. Ivy looked like she was holding herself very still on purpose. He went to the office and knocked twice and told Leo what had happened and what was coming next. Leo asked if it was going to work, and Caleb said he didn't know, but that it was the best hand they had, and they were playing it. Leo unlocked the door and came out, and the four of them stood together in the warehouse in the cold gray light, coming to the gaps in the boards, and waited. The 30 minutes felt like longer. Ada stood at the north wall window, where Mitch's people could see her. She stood straight and still, and looked out at the parking lot with the expression of someone who had made peace with difficult outcomes. Caleb watched the loading dock. Ivy stood beside him with the crowbar, and Leo stood beside her with a hammer, and nobody talked. At 28 minutes, Mitch's footsteps came back to the loading dock. He said he had a counteroffer. He said Paul could leave, but he left with nothing but the clothes he was standing in, and Caleb's group cleared out a hardware store within 48 hours and found somewhere else to be. Caleb looked at Ada. She gave him a small nod that said it was enough. Caleb told Mitch they had a deal. Mitch said he would send Paul to the loading dock in 10 minutes. Caleb said they would be waiting. The 10 minutes passed. Then there was a knock at the loading dock that was different from any of the previous knocks. Uncertain, like someone who wasn't sure they were doing it right. Caleb lifted the door 2 feet, and a man slid under it and stood up in the warehouse. He was in his late 30s and thinner than he should have been, and he blinked in the low light of the warehouse like someone who had been in a dimmer place for a while. He looked around the space, and then his eyes found Ada, and the sound he made was not a word. Ada crossed the warehouse in 4 steps and put both arms around her brother and held on. Caleb lowered the door and shot the latch and stood back. Ivy was beside him, and he reached over without looking and took her hand, and she held it. Leo watched Ada and Paul from across the warehouse with an expression that was complicated for a 12-year-old, but not surprising given everything. Paul was shaking, not from cold. After a while, Ada pulled back and looked at her brother and said she had him and they were leaving. Paul looked at Caleb and said thank you, and Caleb said he hadn't done much, and Paul said he had done enough. They spent the next hour talking through what came next. The 48-hour deadline was real, and none of them doubted Mitch would honor it for exactly that long. Caleb said they needed to be gone in 24 hours to give themselves a buffer. Ada said she knew a location 2 miles southeast that she had scoped 3 weeks ago and had been saving as an option, a small warehouse attached to a plumbing supply company. Ground floor only with 2 access points and a back room that locked. She said it was smaller than the hardware store, but cleaner to fend with 4 people who knew what they were doing. Paul said he knew the building. He said there was a fuel supply in the back room that the previous occupants had left, and that the back room was stocked with copper pipe fittings and insulation, and a commercial water heater that could be rigged to run on the stored fuel. He said it was a better winter position. Caleb looked at Ivy, and Ivy looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at him. She said she wanted to see it before they committed, and Ada said that was fair. Caleb asked Leo where he was going, and Leo looked at the floor and said he didn't know. Caleb said not knowing was allowed, and that until he figured out he was with them. Leo didn't say anything, but his shoulders came down a ½ inch. That was enough. They packed through the night. Caleb sorted everything into what they could carry and what they had to leave. Ada and Paul pulled lightweight high-value items off the warehouse shelves, including a hand-cranked flashlight still in its packaging that Caleb had walked past a dozen times. Leo carried loads without being asked. By 3 a.m, the packs were built and the plan was set. Ivy sat at the office desk one last time and opened the log. She wrote the date and the inventory and the destination. She wrote Ada and Paul's names and what Ada had done alone for 11 days. She wrote Leo's name and the folded blanket and the crawl space and the hammer. She wrote what Caleb said at the loading dock and the sound of Mitch's breathing when he was recalculating. She wrote that they had arrived with 2 bags and were leaving with 5 people and more than they came with in every way that counted. She closed the log and put it in her pack. At first light, they went out the bathroom window 1. At a time into the cold, clear morning, they moved south and east with Caleb at the front and Ada beside him and Leo beside Ivy at the back. The dead were sparse in the cold air. Caleb kept the pace and didn't look back. Ivy did. She looked back once from the edge of the parking lot and saw the building dark behind them with its boarded windows and reinforced doors and the scratch mark on the warehouse floor that had started all of it. Then she turned and followed the others. 2 blocks east, Caleb stopped and looked at Ada. She pointed southeast. They kept moving. The plumbing supply building was where Ada said it would be. The back room was locked, and Paul had the key on a cord around his neck, which he had kept for 3 months on a chance he might need it again. The lock turned. The door opened. They went inside and pulled it shut behind them and stood in the dark for a moment breathing. Then Caleb found a hand-crank flashlight in his pack and cranked it and turned it on and held it up. The room was exactly what Paul had described, better than what they had left. Ivy looked around the space and then looked at Caleb, and he looked back at her. She reached into her pack and pulled out the log and set it on the shelf beside the door. She uncapped the pen. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she wrote the address of the building they were standing in. Then she wrote day 1. The room smelled like dust and coal metal. It was smaller than the office at the hardware store, but the concrete block walls were solid, and the ceiling was low enough to hold heat. Paul moved along the shelves, calling out what he found in a low voice. Copper fittings and solder and pipe wrap insulation, and a heavy canvas tarp on the bottom shelf. Ada stood beside him, and her expression was that of someone who had been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. Leo walked the perimeter, slowly running his hand along the wall the way someone does when they are checking if a place is real. Caleb watched him and thought about the boy who had pounded on the loading dock door 3 weeks ago and what that boy had become since. Ivy had the log open on the shelf, writing fast. Caleb stood beside her and watched her write everything from the last 24 hours. Paul coming under the door, the walk through the city, the key on the cord, day 1. He looked around at the others and then back at Ivy. She had stopped writing and was looking at him. He said they needed sleep, and she said she knew. He said it was a good room, and she said it was. He said they were going to be okay, and she looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said she believed that more today than the day before, and that was something. He said it was enough. She capped the pen and closed the log. Caleb told the others they needed a watch rotation and some rest. Ada said she would take first watch, and Paul started to argue, and she looked at him the way an older sister looks after spending 11 days tracking a dangerous man to get her brother back, and Paul stopped. Leo said he could take second, and Caleb said that was good. He and Ivy laid their sleeping bags on the canvas tarp Paul had spread on the floor. Without the wind, the room was manageable. Caleb laid down and looked at the ceiling for a while. He could hear Ada moving quietly near the door, doing her watch, and Leo asking Paul a low question about the water heater, and Paul answering it patiently. He could hear Ivy beside him breathing slow and steady. He thought about everything that had brought them to this room. The cold apartment and the 2 bags in the hardware store, and Leo on the warehouse floor, and Mitch at the door and Ada on the fire escape, and Paul coming under the loading dock door. He thought about the scratch on the floor and how something meant to end them had set everything that saved them in motion. He closed his eyes. Outside, the city was cold and quiet. The dead moved through the empty streets in the slow way they moved in winter. The door was solid and the lock was good, and there were 5 people inside who had chosen the same direction. Caleb slept.